Richard Bennett thought his wealth could solve any problem, but he never realized that for 20 years, the woman cooking his meals was secretly managing a crisis he didn't even know he had. This is the story of a wealthy American businessman named Richard Bennett, a man who believed he had built a life where money could solve almost every problem, and of Naomi Carter, the quiet cook who worked in his home for nearly 2 decades and seemed content living a simple life that most people overlooked. Richard believed he knew every person who walked through the doors of his estate. He believed loyalty could be measured through contracts, salaries, and years of service. Yet the person who understood him better than anyone else was the one he appreciated the least. What happened between these two lives would eventually leave doctors speechless, bankers searching through years of forgotten records, and an entire community asking the same question. How could a woman earning an ordinary wage secretly prepare to save the life of a millionaire who never realized she was protecting his future? Stay with us until the very end, because every chapter of this story reveals another piece of a truth that becomes more emotional the deeper you follow it. And by the final moments, you may find yourself looking at kindness, gratitude, and sacrifice in a completely different way. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Richard Bennett built his fortune one difficult decision at a time. He was born into a hard-working family outside Chicago, where every dollar mattered and every meal represented another day of perseverance. His father repaired heavy machinery in a small workshop that smelled of grease and hot steel, while his mother spent decades stocking shelves and managing the checkout lines of a neighborhood grocery store. Richard often said that watching his parents work themselves to exhaustion taught him that success belonged to the people willing to sacrifice comfort for opportunity. By the age of 28, he had launched a modest manufacturing business with borrowed money and more determination than experience. The early years were filled with sleepless nights, missed family gatherings, and constant uncertainty, yet he refused to quit. One contract became 10, 10 became 100, and before long his company expanded across several states. Newspapers admired his discipline, business magazines praised his leadership, and competitors respected the calm confidence that seemed to define every decision he made. From the outside, his life appeared complete. His companies were thriving, his investments continued to grow, and his estate reflected everything he had spent a lifetime building. Yet the one thing Richard could never replace was the warmth that disappeared after losing his wife, Susan, to a long battle with illness nearly 8 years earlier. The house went quiet after his wife died, and despite employing dozens of people to maintain his property, there were evenings when the mansion felt emptier than the small apartment where he had started his career decades before. Work became his refuge, because spreadsheets, contracts, and meetings never reminded him of what he had lost. But while Richard was busy running an empire to forget his grief, Naomi was in the kitchen, silently noticing everything he tried to hide. People assumed he had moved on because he rarely spoke about grief, but grief has a way of settling quietly into the routines of everyday life. It followed him through the long hallways of his home, sat beside him during dinner, and greeted him every morning before the sun had fully risen. The only person who seemed to understand this without asking questions was the woman preparing breakfast before anyone else arrived. Naomi Carter had worked in the Bennett household for almost 19 years, long enough to remember the days when Susan personally chose flowers for the kitchen table every Friday afternoon and insisted everyone, including the staff, sit together for Thanksgiving dinner after the guests had gone home. Naomi was in her late 50s, soft-spoken, remarkably organized, and known by everyone in the house for arriving before sunrise regardless of the weather. She lived alone in a modest neighborhood, nearly 40 minutes away, yet she was never late. Even during heavy snowstorms, she somehow reached the estate before the security team changed shifts. She never asked for attention, never involved herself in household gossip, and never complained when unexpected guests doubled her workload. Richard noticed she was always there, but he never really said thank you. To him, She was simply an employee who had remained dependable for many years. He never wondered why she continued working despite having enough experience to seek easier employment closer to home. He never asked why she wore the same winter coat every year or why she politely declined invitations to staff celebrations. Most people assumed she simply preferred a quiet life. Others believed she struggled financially and chose to save every penny. Nobody actually knew because Naomi answered personal questions with a gentle smile before changing the subject. There was something about her calm nature that discouraged further questions, and over time, everyone accepted that some people simply carried private chapters of their lives they preferred to leave unopened. Every December, Richard rewarded his employees with generous holiday bonuses. His companies had always performed well, and he believed loyalty deserved recognition. The housekeeper accepted hers with tears of gratitude because it helped pay college tuition for her granddaughter. The groundskeeper used his knots to renovate the roof of his home. The chauffeur once admitted his bonus had covered months of medical bills after his wife underwent surgery. Yet every single year, Naomi Carter quietly returned the envelope before leaving for the evening. She thanked Richard for his generosity but insisted someone else needed it more. At first, he thought she was embarrassed and instructed his accountant to include the amount in her next paycheck instead. She noticed immediately and asked payroll to remove it. The following year, he doubled the bonus, convinced she would finally accept it. She refused again, with the same polite smile. By the 5th year, the entire household had started talking about it, because nobody could understand why someone earning an ordinary salary would repeatedly decline thousands of dollars. Richard even joked one Christmas that perhaps she had secretly won the lottery and no longer needed his money. Naomi laughed softly but offered no explanation. He didn't know it yet, but that the money wasn't being rejected because she didn't need it. It was being rejected because she was already paying a debt he didn't even know he owed. Eventually, he stopped insisting because he believed everyone had the right to make unusual choices if those choices affected no one else. What Richard never considered was that Naomi's decision had everything to do with him, even though he remained completely unaware of it. There were little moments that seemed ordinary on their own, but carried a meaning no one recognized at the time. Richard would rush downstairs after oversleeping for an early meeting, only to discover breakfast already packed into a container, waiting beside his briefcase. If he returned home exhausted, after traveling across the country, his favorite homemade soup would somehow be simmering on the stove before he even mentioned feeling unwell. When his migraines became more frequent, herbal tea appeared beside his desk, without anyone announcing it. If he skipped lunch because he became absorbed in work, Naomi found quiet ways to place food within reach before disappearing again. She never interrupted conversations or asked how business was going. She simply paid attention to details that everyone else overlooked. Richard occasionally thanked her, believing she was simply exceptional at her job, but gratitude was never what motivated Naomi. She observed him with the quiet concern of someone protecting something fragile, although no one noticed because genuine care often hides within ordinary routines. Several employees remarked over the years that Naomi seemed able to predict Richard's needs before he recognized them himself. They laughed about it, calling her the heartbeat of the household, but none of them imagined how painfully accurate that description would eventually become. As the years passed, Richard settled into routines so predictable that most mornings unfolded almost exactly the same. He woke before 6, reviewed financial reports while drinking black coffee, answered emails before breakfast, and left the estate before most of the city had fully awakened. Naomi learned those routines without ever being told. She noticed when he slept less because the coffee pot emptied faster than usual. She noticed when the pressure of negotiations caused him to lose his appetite because untouched toast would still be sitting on the plate 20 minutes later. She noticed the small cough that lingered after winter had ended, the moments when he paused halfway up the staircase to catch his breath, and the way he occasionally pressed 2 fingers against the center of his chest before quietly pretending nothing had happened. Richard dismissed every sign as nothing more than the price of growing older. He had spent decades believing hard work demanded endurance, and admitting weakness simply was not part of his nature. Naomi never challenged him directly, because she understood that some people became defensive the moment concern sounded too personal. Instead, she quietly adjusted the meals she prepared, reducing salt, adding more fresh vegetables, replacing heavy desserts with fruit, and finding subtle ways to encourage healthier habits without making him feel as though someone was monitoring his life. Richard appreciated the meals but never questioned why his favorite recipes had slowly changed over the years. To him, it was simply another example of Naomi's thoughtful cooking. To Naomi, every healthier meal was another silent attempt to protect a man who refused to believe his own body was asking for help. The rest of the household admired Naomi, but they also found her difficult to understand. She never participated in office gossip, never discussed politics, never complained about rising prices, and never spoke about family, except to mention that she hoped everyone else would make time for theirs. During lunch breaks, the staff often gathered in the small employee dining room, laughing over stories from the weekend or planning vacations together. Naomi almost always excused herself after only a few minutes, carrying an old leather notebook that had become as familiar as the apron she wore every day. She would disappear for nearly an hour before quietly returning to work as though nothing unusual had happened. Some believed she attended Bible study nearby. Others suspected she volunteered at a shelter. One employee even joked that perhaps she was secretly writing a best-selling novel because she guarded that notebook as though it contained priceless secrets. Naomi never confirmed or denied any of the theories. She simply smiled, thanked everyone for their concern, and continued with her responsibilities. Curiosity eventually gave way to acceptance, because people naturally stop asking questions when they receive the same gentle silence year after year. Looking back, many of those employees would later admit the answers had been sitting in front of them all along. They simply failed to recognize them because the truth seemed too ordinary to attract attention. One afternoon, Richard returned home much earlier than expected, after a business meeting was unexpectedly canceled. As he entered the kitchen, he found Naomi sitting alone at the small wooden table she used to organize grocery receipts. The leather notebook lay open before her, but the moment she heard footsteps, she calmly closed it and slipped it into her handbag. Richard apologized for interrupting and laughed that he finally managed to surprise the only person in the house who always seemed one step ahead of everyone else. Naomi laughed politely, though there was something almost protective in the way she held the notebook close to her side. Richard teased her by asking whether she was keeping recipes from him. She replied that some things were simply reminders she preferred to keep private, and he respected her answer without another question. Their conversation lasted less than 5 minutes before he returned to his office upstairs. By evening, he had forgotten about the notebook entirely. Naomi, however, remained seated in the kitchen for several more minutes after he left, gently running her hand across the worn leather cover before placing it back inside her bag. Unknown to anyone else, every page inside contained dates, numbers, handwritten calculations, and notes she had carefully maintained for nearly 9 years. It was not a diary. It was not a collection of recipes. It was a record of a promise she intended to keep, regardless of how long it took. The first sign that something was seriously wrong arrived on an unusually warm spring morning. Richard was preparing to leave for an important meeting with investors when he suddenly stopped halfway across the foyer. His briefcase slipped from his hand and struck the marble floor with a loud echo that brought several employees running from different parts of the house. Naomi reached him first. She watched his face lose its color as he gripped the banister, struggling to catch a breath that seemed just beyond his reach. Richard insisted he was only dizzy and attempted to continue walking, but after taking only a few more steps, he collapsed. The silence that followed lasted only a second before panic filled the house. Emergency services were called immediately, and within minutes, paramedics were working to stabilize him before transporting him to the nearest cardiac hospital. Naomi remained unusually calm throughout the chaos. She gathered his medical folder from the study without being asked, contacted his executive assistant with remarkable composure, and quietly locked the front door after the ambulance departed. The other employees later described that morning as one of the most frightening days they had ever experienced. Yet what stood out most in their memories was Naomi's expression. She did not appear shocked. She appeared deeply saddened, as though something she had feared for years had finally happened, despite every effort she had made to prevent it. Several hours later, Richard regained consciousness in a hospital room, surrounded by monitors whose steady rhythm offered a reassuring contrast to the uncertainty filling his thoughts. His cardiologist spoke carefully, choosing every word with the precision expected when delivering life-changing news. Years of stress, family history, and a heart condition that had gradually worsened without obvious symptoms had placed Richard in immediate danger. Medication could help for a short time, but it would not solve the underlying problem. He needed major heart surgery, and delaying it significantly increased the risk of another collapse that might not end as fortunately as the first. Richard listened without interruption, asking practical questions about recovery time, business obligations, and projected costs, but his confidence slowly faded as the consultation continued. For the first time since building his company, he faced a problem that determination alone could not overcome. As the doctor left the room, Richard stared through the hospital window at the city skyline, where he had built his entire career. The buildings looked exactly as they always had, yet everything inside him felt different. Down the hallway, Naomi sat quietly in the waiting area, her hands folded tightly together. She had said almost nothing since arriving at the hospital, but her eyes remained fixed on the consultation room door. She did not need to hear the doctor's diagnosis to understand its meaning. Long before anyone else recognized the seriousness of Richard Bennett's condition, Naomi Carter had already been preparing for the day his heart would need more than medicine to keep beating. The days following Richard Bennett's diagnosis became some of the most difficult of his life. Although his companies remained valuable on paper, a combination of legal delays, frozen investment accounts tied to a pending corporate acquisition, and the time-sensitive nature of his condition left him facing an unexpected financial obstacle. The surgery needed to happen immediately, yet moving enough money quickly proved far more complicated than anyone had imagined. Richard had spent a lifetime believing that wealth guaranteed security, but as the days passed, he discovered that even great fortunes could become temporarily out of reach when time refused to wait. Calls were made to business associates who had once proudly called him a friend. Some offered encouraging words but no real help. Others simply stopped answering altogether. The house that had once welcomed a steady stream of visitors became unusually quiet. Through it all, Naomi Carter continued arriving before sunrise every morning. She prepared meals Richard could barely eat, visited him after finishing her work, and never spoke about his financial worries. She simply encouraged him to focus on getting stronger, reminding him that some battles had to be won one day at a time. Just as hope seemed to be slipping away, the hospital administrator informed Richard that the full amount required for his life-saving surgery had already been received through an anonymous payment. Richard immediately assumed one of his business partners had stepped forward without wanting recognition, but every phone call ended with the same answer. No one claimed responsibility. Even his attorneys were unable to identify who had transferred such a significant amount of money. Hospital privacy rules prevented the staff from revealing the donor's identity, leaving Richard with more questions than answers. The surgery proceeded successfully, and after several hours that felt like an eternity to everyone waiting outside the operating room, the lead surgeon emerged with a smile and reassuring words. Richard's heart was beating strongly again. His recovery was expected to take time, but the greatest danger had passed. Richard was overwhelmed with gratitude, yet one question remained at the center of his thoughts every single day. Who had quietly stepped forward at the exact moment he needed help the most? Several weeks later, after Richard had returned home to continue his recovery, an unexpected phone call changed everything. His longtime bank manager requested a private meeting regarding an account that had recently drawn attention during a routine financial review connected to the anonymous payment. Richard assumed it involved one of his own investments, but as the manager carefully laid years of financial records across the conference table, he realized the documents belonged to someone else entirely. The account holder was Naomi Carter. For nearly 9 years, she had deposited every Christmas bonus, every salary increase she had declined, every gift card converted into cash, and every extra payment Richard had insisted she accept. Month after month, year after year, the balance quietly grew. The account had only one listed beneficiary, should a specific medical emergency ever arise. That beneficiary was Richard Bennett. The bank manager admitted he had never seen anything like it in his entire career. Naomi had built the account with one purpose, and one purpose alone. She believed there would come a day when Richard's heart would need saving, and she wanted to make certain money would never be the reason he lost his life. Richard sat in complete silence, unable to speak as memories from nearly 2 decades came flooding back. Every refused bonus, every gentle smile, every simple answer of, "I already have enough." Suddenly, every moment carried a meaning he had failed to understand. When he finally found the strength to visit Naomi's modest home, he was humbled before he even stepped through the front door. The small house showed signs of careful maintenance, but very little comfort. The furniture had been repaired more than replaced. The kitchen appliances were decades old. Her old winter coat still hung beside the entrance. She had spent years denying herself conveniences that most people would consider ordinary, choosing instead to prepare for someone else's future. Richard asked the only question that mattered. "Why would you do all of this for me?" Naomi smiled with the same quiet warmth she had carried throughout the years, and answered softly, "Because years ago, when my husband passed away, I was left with nothing but fear. You gave me work when no one else would. You treated me with respect when I felt invisible. You gave me stability, dignity, and hope. I could never repay that debt with money, but I could make sure that if the day ever came when your life depended on it, you would have a chance to keep living." Tears filled Richard's eyes as he realized he had spent years believing generosity was measured by the size of a paycheck, while Naomi had quietly demonstrated that true generosity is measured by the willingness to sacrifice for another person without expecting anything in return. Naomi never considered herself extraordinary. She simply believed that when we have the opportunity to protect another person's future, we should never wait for applause before doing what is right. Her kindness became a reminder that the richest hearts are often found in the simplest homes, and that some of life's greatest heroes wear no titles, seek no fame, and leave behind a legacy that cannot be measured in dollars. If this story touched your heart, take a moment today to thank someone whose quiet kindness has made a difference in your life. Too often, the people who carry the greatest burdens are the ones who ask for the least in return. We'd love to hear your thoughts, so tell us in the comments, what would you have done if you were Richard, and have you ever known someone like Naomi? If you enjoyed this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss another inspiring story. Share this video with someone who still believes that genuine kindness can change a life, because sometimes one quiet act of compassion can echo farther than a lifetime of wealth ever could. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next